I'm thinking about what Frank said in his introduction to the conference this year. And he was talking about the 4 different groups of people: normal people, the conspiracy people, the conscious people, and the spiritual people. And I think that the substance of my talk this year very much addresses that theme that he was talking about there. In that, we talk a lot about waking up, but there's multiple layers to this waking up process. And sometimes we wake up into a carefully constructed cage. And having come into this whole alternative world in a force about like 7 or 8 years ago, and having, I feel now, fallen down all the different rabbit holes that somebody can fall down, I started to see the bigger picture of all of it, which is that there are, groups that are 3 and 4 steps ahead of us in this whole process. And they have anticipated exactly where we're going to go. So there is this like second level to the whole waking up, opening your mind process, which is standing in the place between the, illusion of history, the disinformation, the matrix, whatever you want to call it, of the main world, and the actual truth of history. And you're standing in this kind of sea of disinformation in between, right? So you spend enough time there, you spend enough years there, you start to learn how to navigate these channels pretty, succinctly. And so one of the things I started finding was these patterns where here was a group of people that were saying we're part of a movement. We're changing the world, we're evolving, this is, exactly what our hippie forefathers, expected us to do over the course of a generation. We're all going to work on ourselves and the world was going to change. And I was looking around and the world wasn't changing. And things were kind of getting worse. And I looked at all these people that were supposed to be the evolved ones, and they were in these worlds that were steadily getting smaller and smaller. And the number of people that they could relate to was getting smaller and smaller. And by and large, they were passive and inactive. They did nothing. They talked a lot about themselves. And they were really good at kind of assessing other people and telling them what was wrong with them. But in dealing with real problems, in talking about real problems, in dealing with the issues of the world, there was almost like a paralysis. The first would be a kind of just a retreat, a silent retreat, a kind of a vapid non-engagement, or fear. You would see fear in people's face. And then there'd be this kind of reaction, well, you're just being negative, you're trying to, scare us, we don't choose to have that truth, all of these different ways of kind of saying I don't care, or I don't want to look at that. So after a while it can, it'll frustrate you, but then if you kind of get past the frustration, you start to think, well, what's going on here? This is like a pattern. This is a very wide pattern. And I come from an activist background, so I come from, the world of, direct political organizing and direct radical action. So it's a kind of a totally different approach from what's going on in the alternative cultures, the New Agers and the festivals and the hippie kids and all that. It's almost the exact opposite. But if you take the one perspective and apply it to the other, what you start to see is an organized sense of confusion and passivity, of helplessness. Well, where did this come from? So this opened up a whole new avenue to start exploring, which is where did these movements, where did these values come from? So if we're kind of like a alternative, new age, conscious, spiritual person today, how did we get here? All right, what was our lineage? Okay, so that was the first question I wanted to look at. And then the second was, why do we think and believe and act the way that we do now? There has to be a reason for it, right? So in looking at that, I started to see that there wasn't a couple of guys sitting around a dark room with cigars, we'll get those hippies type of thing, which is what everybody seems to jump to when you talk about this. But what there was an almost institutional belief and an institutional effort to create a new culture out of the chaos of World War II and the Holocaust. So this high-level policy being forged between universities and governments and research institutes and, foundations that are putting up, millions, if not, ultimately billions of dollars in trying to understand the human psyche, understanding human psychology. What motivates us? What creates fascists? How do we create authoritarian or anti-authoritarian personalities? Real hard science went into this stuff. And so in all of this, they were actively trying to come up with a new type of culture. And they kind of realized that what was at the root of so much of the animosity and so much of the violence and so much of the, straight up racial hatred, racial and ethnic hatred that would happen in the Holocaust to Jews and Gypsies and Slavs and communists and homosexuals and all that, was these racial or perceived racial, ethnic and religious differences. And the philosophy was if you broke down all of those differences and created one race of people where we are all one, we have one God, our goddess, our mother planet, Gaia, and we are all brothers and sisters, and the color of our skin is irrelevant, and our language is irrelevant, and our cultural history is irrelevant, and everything is irrelevant. The only thing that matters is we are all one. And so this became a blueprint, an actual plan that was made in the late 1940s, early 1950s. And in various formats over time, specifically in the late 1960s, 70s, and 80s, this was kind of rolled out into the culture. And it specifically hit the kind of affluent Western counterculture, the kind of people that were ready to accept a different kind of programming. You see, there's this old maxim that if it's not broke, don't fix it, right? And so if you have people controlled just by simply getting up, going to their jobs, coming home, watching their TV, buying their products, going to Walmart and stampeding every Christmas, if that makes them happy, great. Why change it? But over time, there was a larger and larger group of us that were starting to reject the programming. And that generation, my parents' generation, rebelled in the 60s and 70s pretty heavily against that. And so from the point of social engineers who are trying to create a more peaceful planet, they have two problems that are kind of coming into collusion. They're paradoxical problems. The first is that they raised this generation, this affluent baby boomer generation, to believe in things like democracy, justice, law, equality, and yet they were seeing that the system was anything but. And so they were demanding this change, but in order to keep this system where they were the affluent, educated, favored class, they had to keep this system of kind of corporate imperialism going, right? It was a paradox. You have this generation that is coming of age, and it's a global generation, concentrated in the Western world, but you have it in Japan, you have it in Latin America, you have it in Europe, you have it in the United States and Canada. And they are demanding a better world, and they're seeing the threat of nuclear annihilation and all of that going on, the Vietnam War and all the anti-colonial struggles. And so they had this strange, historically unique mix, which was they had time on their hands to sit around and learn because they came from affluent societies that put money into socialized education. So they all got to go to college, they all got to sit around and talk about politics, and they all had access to the media, and the news back then actually kind of used to report, this thing called news, right? So in seeing this world, they got active and they revolted. 1968 was the pinnacle year of, student and labor revolt around the world. And the United States was spared almost all of the student-led revolt in 68. But in the inner cities and in the African-American world, it was complete chaos. Martin Luther King had been assassinated. Bobby Kennedy was very soon to be assassinated. The Democratic Convention happened in Chicago where the police were turned loose on the demonstrators. And after that, things got quiet in the United States because Nixon became president and launched this, assassination program against the anti-war movement and against Black Panthers. Now this came about specifically to, harness and to kind of diffuse one very specific kind of revolutionary energy. But right around, this is like serious radical stuff. This is like, communist inspired. This was, the Cuban Revolution and Ben Barka and the Algerian Revolution. And so there was a lineage here going into this. And then all of a sudden, this new archetype appears, this flower child, this hippie archetype. Very different creature. Not into these politics things, not speaking this language. There's a kind of a crossover with the drugs and the kind of freedom, that drugs represented in some ways. But for the most part, this is a completely different creature, a different animal with a completely different message. So you have this radical archetype, this radical student archetype. That's a kind of a global archetype. It's a phenomenon that's going on all over, okay? And then in two very specific places, you have this new archetype emerge, and that's specifically the United States and the United Kingdom, and specifically London, New York, and San Francisco. You have these cultural centers. You have this hippie thing show up. And so the hippies archetype and the hippie message is completely different from the radical student, radical activist message, right? So they're more, well, as the Grateful Dead, as Jerry Garcia put it in an interview on national television, on CBS television in 1967, he said, well, we're not into all this political stuff, and we're not into revolution, and we don't want anybody to get hurt, and, we just want people to live a simple, uncluttered life. We want people to be able to do what they want to do and be happy. And, it's really that in that language that the shift started, which was instead of being for something beyond yourself, being for a larger cause and a larger betterment, it became about doing for yourself. I want this. I'm doing this for me, for my life, for my art, for my this, for my that. And all of this energy was shifted on this wave of change that was already happening as the kind of conformity of the 1940s and 50s and 60s is coming off, and people are becoming liberated sexually, culturally, musically, artistically. And that energy of change was harnessed, and it was all focused back in on the individual. So instead of taking this huge cultural change and applying it to global politics, it became all about global markets. So it became all about what became known formally in anthropological terms as the culture of narcissism. And we had an informal name for it in the States called the me generation, or the me decade. Right? This is a new thing in the 70s, teaching people that it was okay to just talk about themselves and go on about themselves and focus on themselves. Now, that's all that you see in the United States in particular. And this counterculture, this hippie counterculture, was the bridge. It was this first, act out, make a spectacle of yourself, get as colorful and out there as possible, because then you go farther and farther and farther and farther away from any credibility in a serious political discussion. So although Abby Hoffman and Jerry Rubin were very intelligent activists who were able to get on television and talk politics, the fact that they dressed it all up in this snarky kind of, hippie, anti-authoritarian, yippie thing, only let them take the message so far. And then it was kind of, ghettoized as a youth revolt, or, it was just, the freaks, or it was just the radicals, or this, and then suddenly it's not taken very seriously. So over time, what we start to see is that all of these movements, some way or another touch the branches of the power structure, mostly the military and the intelligence. And you start to look at all these famous rock stars from the 60s, people who shaped our consciousness about it, who wrote the music that were the anthems. And you start to find that they're all from these military and intelligence families, and these old ruling class families that go all the way back to the founding of America. And you find that all of them end up together in this one little area in California, where this whole hippie revolution starts. So it raises a lot of questions about the actual validity of what we thought was like a legitimate revolution. There's a story in the United States that kind of goes like this. America was a land where conformity was law and there wasn't equality or justice because black people were oppressed. But then young people came together and formed the civil rights movement, and they liberated black people from their oppression and segregation. And then that movement became the anti-war movement, which eventually forced Nixon out of office and forced the United States out of Vietnam. That's the story that's told in the United States. And nothing could be farther from the truth. The anti-war movement had absolutely zero impact on Nixon or anybody else's decision as far as the war was concerned. And the civil rights movement didn't grow into the hippie movement. It was, well, you know, some people believe that at some point some aliens came down here and took their DNA and monkey DNA and mixed it together. Okay, well, I don't know whether any of that's true, but if you look at it as a metaphor, it's almost like there was a crossbreeding that happened at some point. There was an intervention. And then now you jump into the 70s and there's all these, you know, resistance movements that kind of, you know, represent the feelings of the times. You got, you know, breakaway communes in communities like Jonestown and Osho. You got cults like Scientology. You've got, you know, all of these rock stars going into their little thing. And you've got, you know, this kind of emerging new age culture coming out of, you know, Esalen and Big Sur. Oh, and then there's also the guerrilla armies. You know, you've got the Symbionese Liberation Army and the Red Army faction, Bader Meinhof, Red Brigades, all of this. So you start looking behind where all of these groups came from and or what were they around, and you start to see the same patterns. Many of them look as if they were actually kind of fabricated from the beginning, like Jonestown. Then like the Rajneeshpuram looks like it was a kind of an operation. There is, you know, evidence and an evidentiary trail that goes back to the mid-60s that has Osho working in conjunction or for the CIA in kind of anti-communist stuff in India. The connections between CIA and Jonestown are quite frightening. You know, at least two known officers, Richard Dwyer and Dan Matrone, were connected directly to Jim Jones. You know, there was a whole medical grade, you know, pharmaceutical grade laboratory of mind-altering drugs down there on site. There was the presence of the U.S. Army, Israeli Special Forces, people being trained from Angola, and then of course an evangelical church called World Vision, which is known to be a CIA front. Now you start taking all these weird coincidences and connections and applying them to all these different things, and you start to see the same connections. You start to see all of this is infiltrated and polluted, like the Ganges. And to some people this might be very discouraging. You know, I've had people say, why are you telling us all this? All you're doing is taking away the one thing that means anything to us, you know, because this is the thing. People break away from this mainstream culture, so they think, okay, well, I don't eat McDonald's and I don't go watch the football game and I don't sit at home and watch TV. I am unique now. I, you know, eat organic food and I meditate and I believe that you should just come from your heart, and I don't get involved in all of this and this and this, and I'm special. I'm evolved. I'm not like you people. And there's a kind of a status and a kind of an exclusionary principle that has become attached to the alternative culture now. Oh, well, either they know or they don't know, you know? And it's almost like a snobbery or a kind of a separation. But I started to see that so many of these people were just replaying the same habits in a different, slightly different model all over again. So they would come in and get this little bit of awakening, you know, which isn't a little bit. I mean, it's a big awakening when you finally realize the original Matrix. But you know, I mean, if you remember in the actual Matrix films, like at the very end of the third movie when he's talking to the architect, he's like, yeah, this is the 6th time we've, you know, built this thing, and this is the 6th time it's come apart. And it's, you know, if we keep looking at it as like a matrix within a matrix, you know, there is a whole other set of like responsibilities that we have once we wake up. And part of that is to stay awake and to keep looking and to not be so naive as to think that we're suddenly free, you know, because we're not. We're still in the same system, beholden by the same laws. And so I believe that in order for us to fulfill our roles, whether you believe democracy is real or not, if we are in democratic republics, then we have an obligation to be informed. And even if we're not thinking of it in the terms of politics, just as people, we have an obligation to be informed as much as possible before making our decisions, like bringing children into the world, or where we're going to put our energy, where we're going to live, where we're going to put our money. And more importantly, you know, if we're going to go around talking about this, you know, evolution or this culture or this revolution or whatever, then we should know what we're talking about in general. We should know what we're up against. And we should understand why we have such a hard time getting anything done. I've been spending time at Christiania, which is, you know, the community here in Denmark. And some of the people that live there have told me that, you know, they do everything by consensus democracy, which is a familiar word from back in the political organizing days. And I said, you know, yeah, and how much, you know, do you get done? And she said, nothing at all. That's the beauty of it, is we just sit around and talk about it, you know, and nobody ever has to do anything, but somehow it works, right? And I think that's kind of what we're up against, is this idea that, like, okay, well, we're still here. Like, life's gonna go on, but do you want life to go on living in a continual illusion, or do you want to know where you're stepping as you're walking through this, you know, newly awake life? And to get to this balanced individual where we have this spirituality and consciousness together means that we have to be able to peacefully coexist with truth. And that means unpleasant truth. That means things that aren't necessarily here to make us feel good. And there is a institutionalized aversion to bad feelings or unpleasantness in this culture. And I get it. I get it. We came into this to get away from the madness and stress and depression of the other culture. But it doesn't mean that we have to go to the other extreme. And it doesn't mean that we embrace everything that we are told now uncritically. And we lose our rational thinking faculties. Yes, we need to get in touch with our heart more. Yes, we need to become more compassionate, but we don't need to forget how to think, you know, how to make decisions and how to evaluate information. So I am attempting to present a lot of information that will be kind of difficult for people to grasp. And it's the kind of stuff that you have to really sit with for a while. It takes a while to see these patterns, you know. I've been at this specific game for, I want to say, what is it now, 2014? I would say 15 years. You know, I've been specifically researching and writing and investigating political history, really. And it's only really in the last few years that I've been able to really understand the depth of these patterns and how these things operate. So it's okay, you don't have to like know it all tomorrow. You don't even have to like understand it all. You just have to know that things aren't always as they appear. And there might be a reason why you can't get that movement started in your town. There might be a reason why every time you get close to some serious change in society or in the political structure, that it gets somehow undermined or falls apart. There might be a reason why that wonderful community group that you put together suddenly had this person show up and destroy all of it. You know, these are questions that people need answered, and they're also a set of awareness that people really need to have. So some of our responsibility really is just providing that information, you know, and letting everybody else make up their own minds.